Jake Morrison stood before two graves, one large and one small, as snow fell silently around him in the heart of Texas winter. The white flakes gathered on his broad shoulders and melted into his dark beard. In his right hand, a Colt .45 revolver hung heavy, its barrel catching the dull winter light. Behind him, footsteps crunched in the snow. Jake turned, his breath clouding in the frigid air, and faced the woman nobody wanted. Her eyes met his across the distance, gray as storm clouds and just as threatening. For a moment, neither moved. Then she took a step forward, and the world changed forever. 1 month earlier, wind howled across the Texas plains, rattling the shutters of the Morrison ranch house. Inside, Jake stared at the dying embers in the fireplace, a half-empty whiskey glass dangling from his calloused fingers. The cabin felt too large and too small all at once. Too large without Sarah's laughter filling the corners. Too small with the weight of memories pressing in on all sides. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Jake's head lifted, listening for his children. But the house settled back into silence. The kind of silence that had haunted these walls for 3 years now. Ever since the fire that claimed everything he held dear. Setting aside his glass, he rose and made his way up the narrow staircase, each step groaning under his weight as if sharing his burden. The door to Ben's room stood slightly ajar. Jake pushed it open to find his 9-year-old son sitting bolt upright in bed, blue eyes wide and unblinking in the moonlight, streaming through frost-covered windows. The boy's sandy hair stuck up in places, damp with sweat despite the chill that seeped through the cabin's wooden walls. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Not since the fire that had claimed Sarah and 4-year-old Tommy 3 years ago, when flames had devoured the old barn where his mother and brother had been trapped. Ben hadn't spoken a word since that night, since he'd watched his father rush into the inferno only to emerge alone, skin blistered and heartbroken beyond repair. "Another nightmare?" Jake asked softly, knowing no answer would come. Ben's fingers clutched the quilt Sarah had made, knuckles white with the force of his grip. The boy had not spoken since that terrible night, carrying his grief in silence, like a stone in his chest. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping beneath his weight. He reached out, hesitated, then awkwardly patted his son's shoulder. Ben flinched but didn't pull away, accepting this small comfort from a father who had forgotten how to offer it freely. "It's all right," Jake said, the words hollow even to his own ears. Nothing had been all right since the fire. Nothing would ever be all right again. Not in the way it had been before. Across the hall, a door creaked open. Lucy stood in her nightgown, her 6-year-old frame small against the darkness. Her long blonde hair, so like her mother's, hung in tangles around her face, tangles Jake had tried and failed to master each morning since Sarah's death. "Pa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. "Is Ben having the bad dreams again?" Jake nodded, unable to find his voice for a moment. Lucy padded across the cold floorboards and climbed onto Ben's bed, curling against her brother like a kitten seeking warmth. Ben's rigid posture softened slightly as Lucy took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his. "Mama used to sing when we had bad dreams," Lucy said, her voice small but clear in the night. "And Tommy liked it when she played the fiddle." Jake's throat tightened at the mention of his youngest son. The fiddle still hung on the wall downstairs, untouched since Sarah had last played it. He couldn't bring himself to remove it, nor could he bear to hear its music again. It was a relic of a life that felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. "It's late," he said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "Both of you need sleep." Lucy looked up at him with Sarah's blue eyes, searching his weathered face for something he wasn't sure he could give anymore. "When are Mom and Tommy coming home?" she asked, the question that never failed to strike him like a physical blow. It wasn't the first time she had asked, and Jake had no better answer now than he'd had before. The child's mind seemed unable to grasp the permanence of death, clinging to hope like a drowning person clings to driftwood. "They're not coming home, Lucy," he said, his voice carrying more harshness than he intended. "They're with God now." "But God has lots of people," Lucy insisted with a child's simple logic. "He doesn't need Mama and Tommy. We do." Jake had no response to that. His faith, once as sturdy as the mountains on the horizon, had crumbled to dust the night of the fire. What God would take a mother from her children? What divine plan required the sacrifice of a 4-year-old boy who had never harmed a soul? "Sleep," he said again, rising from the bed with movements that betrayed his 45 years. "Tomorrow's another day." As he turned to leave, Ben's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength for such a small boy. The child's eyes were pleading, desperate, speaking volumes that his voice could not. Jake hesitated, then sank back down beside his son. "All right," he murmured, settling in for another long night of keeping watch over children who had seen too much, lost too much, survived too much. "I'll stay until you sleep." Outside, the wind continued its lonely song across the Texas plains, a sound as desolate as Jake's own heart. Inside, he kept vigil over his broken family, a man as weathered as the land he worked, land that demanded everything and gave little in return. But it was all he had left. This ranch, these children, this endless cycle of sunrise and sunset that marked the passage of days he no longer counted, with anticipation but merely endured. The Morrison Ranch had once been a place of laughter and music, of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, of plans made and dreams shared. Now it was a monument to loss, haunted by the ghosts of what had been and the specter of what would never be again. Tomorrow would bring another day of struggle, another day of pretending that routine could heal what seemed permanently broken. But tonight, in the darkness of his son's room, Jake Morrison held vigil over all that remained of his world. 2 children as damaged as himself, bound together by grief and the stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Morrison Ranch. Jake stood on the porch, coffee mug steaming in his hand, surveying his kingdom of dust and struggle. The rebuilt barn stood sturdy against the morning light, but the fences sagged and the cattle looked thin after a harsh winter. Ben emerged from the house already dressed for work. Though small for his age, the boy moved with purpose, heading straight for the woodpile. He took up an axe too large for his frame and began splitting kindling with grim determination no 9-year-old should possess. "Leave some for tomorrow," Jake called out. Ben paused, nodded once, then resumed his rhythmic chopping. Lucy appeared next, struggling with tangles in her blonde hair. "Pa, my hair's all knotted and I can't reach," she complained. Jake set down his coffee with a sigh. Sarah had always handled Lucy's hair, weaving neat braids each morning. His large fingers were too clumsy for such delicate work. "Just tie it back for now," he said, avoiding Lucy's disappointed gaze. "We'll sort it properly later." But later never came. Everything was pushed to later these days. After breakfast, Jake took his rifle down from above the door. "I'm heading to town," he announced. "Need fence wire, seed for planting, maybe a mule if the price is right." Ben looked up from washing dishes, a question in his blue eyes that he couldn't voice. Jake knelt before his son. "You're in charge while I'm gone. Keep your sister safe. The shotgun's loaded if you need it." Ben nodded solemnly, accepting responsibility far beyond his years. The town of Redemption, Texas, existed more in aspiration than reality, a cluster of wooden buildings lining a single muddy street. Jake tethered his horse outside Santos General Store. "Morrison," called out Carlos Santos as Jake entered. "Didn't expect to see you before spring. What brings you to town?" "Need supplies," Jake replied. "Fence wire, seed for planting." Santos nodded sympathetically. The entire town knew of Jake's losses. "Got wire in stock. Seeds are dear this year, but I can spare some for a good customer." While Santos wrapped his goods, Jake browsed the meager shelves. His gaze lingered on a blue ribbon, the kind Sarah might have used for Lucy's hair. After a moment's hesitation, he added it to his purchase. "There's an auction at noon," Santos mentioned casually. "Might find that mule you're after, though there's more than livestock on the block today." "How's that?" Santos leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Sheriff found a woman living wild up in the hill country. Been trapping and hunting like a man. They're putting her up for auction. Work contract, you understand." The idea sat uneasily with Jake, but he knew such things happen in frontier towns. "Any takers?" "Not many. Well, she's not what most men would call appealing. Too tall, too strong, too independent. the kind who looks like she could wrestle a bear and win. Jake found himself drawn toward the livery stable where the auction would be held. Already a small crowd was gathering, mostly ranchers and farmers looking for bargains. The woman stood apart from the livestock, her back straight despite the circumstances. She was indeed tall, nearly matching Jake's height, with broad shoulders and strong hands. Her dark hair hung in a tangled braid, and her dress had seen better days. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, gray as storm clouds and filled with fierce dignity that no auction block could diminish. She didn't look broken. If anything, she looked dangerous, like a wildcat backed into a corner. The auctioneer called for attention. Lot 17, mountain woman found living wild. Strong back, doesn't eat much, works like two men. Starting bid is $5. Silence greeted this announcement. Come now, gentlemen, the auctioneer cajoled. Look at those shoulders, those hands. This one could plow a field from sunup to sundown. A few crude comments rose from the crowd. Jake's jaw tightened, and he noticed the woman's hands curl into fists. $3, the auctioneer called out, desperation creeping into his voice. Surely someone can see the value in $3 worth of hard work. More snickers from the crowd. Jake found himself studying the woman's face, seeing past the weathered skin to something else, a strength that reminded him of Sarah, but harder, more tempered by survival. $3, the auctioneer repeated. Any takers at $3? Jake thought of his children at home, of Ben's silent burden and Lucy's tangled hair. He thought of fences that needed mending and fields that needed planting. Most of all, he thought of Sarah, who would never have stood by while a woman was subjected to such humiliation. I'll take her, he heard himself say, his hand rising before his mind had processed the decision. Surprised murmurs rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer's face brightened with relief. Sold to Morrison for $3. As Jake approached to complete the transaction, he felt the woman's gaze upon him. Not grateful, not fearful, but assessing. She was measuring him just as he had measured her. He placed $3 silver in the auctioneer's palm. She's yours now, the man said, offering Jake a length of rope. Good luck. You'll need it. Jake looked at the rope, then at the woman. Slowly, deliberately, he let the rope drop to the dusty ground. Can you walk? He asked her directly. She regarded him for a long moment, those storm-gray eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded once. Then walk beside me, he said simply. I don't lead people on ropes. As they made their way toward his horse, Jake could feel the stares following them. He had just purchased a wild woman for $3, and by evening, every person in the county would know about it. You got a name? He asked as they reached his horse. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice roughened by disuse but clear as mountain water, she said, Hannah. Jake froze, the name hitting him like a physical blow. Hannah, his sister's name. Hannah Morrison, who had died in a house fire when Jake was just 12 years old. Hannah, whose screams still sometimes woke him in the deep of night. Something wrong? The woman asked, those gray eyes missing nothing. Jake shook his head, forcing himself to breathe. That was my sister's name, he said gruffly. She died young. The woman, Hannah, held his gaze steadily. I'm sorry, she said, and he could hear that she meant it. Jake nodded once, then offered his hand to help her mount behind him. It's a long ride to my ranch. Hannah regarded his outstretched hand, then took it. Her grip was strong, calloused, and she swung up behind him with surprising grace. Hold on, Jake instructed, feeling her hands rest lightly at his waist. As they rode out of Redemption, whispers followed them like dust. The woman behind him sat straight in the saddle, her presence solid but unobtrusive. She smelled of wood smoke and pine needles. I have 2 children, Jake said after they had ridden in silence. A boy, 9, and a girl, 6. Their mother died 3 years ago. I'm sorry, Hannah said, her voice carrying across the wind. Ranch needs work, Jake continued. More than I can manage alone. The children need... He trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the hollow space Sarah's death had left. I can work, Hannah said simply, and I'm good with children if they'll have me. As they crested the final hill, The Morrison Ranch spread out below them. The main house stood weathered but proud, the rebuilt barn a short distance away. Beyond stretched pastures with sagging fence posts. "It's not fancy," Jake said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's honest," Hannah replied. "That's worth more than fancy." As they rode into the yard, Ben emerged from the barn, stopping short when he saw the woman. Lucy burst from the house, curiosity overcoming caution. "This is Hannah," Jake told them. "She's going to help around the ranch." Ben's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Lucy hung back, peering at Hannah with mixture of curiosity and caution. Hannah nodded respectfully to both children. "Hello," she said, her voice gentle but carrying no false sweetness. "Are you going to be our new mama?" Lucy asked with childish directness. Heat rose in Jake's face. "Miss Hannah is here to work, that's all." Hannah knelt to Lucy's level. "I'm here to help your pa," she said softly. "And maybe help you with that hair if you'd like." Lucy's face brightened. "Yes, please. Pa can't do braids at all." A ghost of a smile touched Hannah's lips. "We'll see what we can manage." As the children moved to help unload supplies, Jake began unpacking his purchases. The fence wire, the seeds, and the blue ribbon seemed like relics from another lifetime now that Hannah was here. He had bought her for $3, but as he watched her interact with his children, patient with Lucy's questions, respectful of Ben's wariness, Jake began to suspect that the true cost might be far higher than $3 silver. For $3, he had purchased more than a worker. He had bought the possibility of change, of healing, of something he wasn't ready to name. As the Texas sun began its descent, Jake Morrison wondered if he had just made the best bargain of his life, or opened a door that could never be closed again. Hannah's first morning at the Morrison Ranch began before dawn. Jake woke to sounds of someone moving quietly through the house. He dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Hannah already at work, having milked the cow and collected eggs. "You're up early," Jake commented, accepting the bucket of fresh milk. "Sun's up, work's waiting," Hannah replied, brushing dark hair from her face. She had braided it back neatly, transforming her wild appearance into something more civilized. Jake nodded, impressed. "Bessie's been giving well for this time of year. You've got a gentle touch with animals." "Animals don't judge," Hannah said simply. "They respond to how you treat them. Nothing more." The children appeared as they finished morning chores. Ben emerged first, already dressed and ready, his blue eyes taking in Hannah's efficiency with grudging respect. Lucy followed, her hair an impossible tangle. "Good morning, Miss Hannah," Lucy said shyly. "Good morning, Lucy," Hannah replied, kneeling to the child's level. "Would you like me to help with your hair before breakfast?" Lucy's face lit up with hope. "Could you really? Pa tries, but—" "Your pa has many talents," Hannah said diplomatically. "Hair braiding might not be one of them." Jake watched as she gently worked through Lucy's tangles with patient fingers, transforming the messy knots into a neat braid secured with the blue ribbon from town. "There," Hannah said, turning Lucy toward the small mirror. "A proper braid for a proper young lady." Lucy beamed at her reflection. Ben watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable but not hostile. Over breakfast of eggs and biscuits that Hannah had somehow made light and fluffy, she proved herself more than just a hard worker. She listened when Lucy chattered about imaginary friends, responding with comments that encouraged without dismissing the child's flights of fancy. More surprisingly, she seemed to understand Ben's silence, not pushing him to speak, but including him with glances and nods. When she asked about his whittling, Ben actually showed her the wooden horse he was carving. "Fine work," Hannah said, examining the piece with genuine interest. "Your hands are steady, and you understand the wood." "That's a gift." Ben's cheeks flushed with pleasure, the first positive emotion Jake had seen from his son in months. After breakfast, Jake outlined the day's work. "North fence needs mending. I'll handle that. You can help with whatever needs doing around the house." Hannah nodded, but her gaze moved to the neglected garden plot. "That soil should be turned soon for early planting," she suggested, "and the chicken coop could use repairs." Jake studied her with growing respect. "You know farming?" A shadow crossed Hannah's face. "I wasn't born in the mountains. I had a life before." The evasion was polite but firm. Jake recognized it as a door closing on questions she wasn't ready to answer. As he worked on the fence, replacing rotted posts and stretching wire, Jake found his thoughts returning to the mysterious woman. There was something that didn't fit the story of a wild mountain woman. Her speech was too educated, her manners too refined beneath the practical surface. By midday, Lucy appeared with lunch wrapped in cloth. "Miss Hannah sent this," she announced, settling beside him. "She made cornbread with honey." Jake unwrapped still warm cornbread, sliced meat, and pickled vegetables arranged with care. The coffee was strong and hot. "She's nice, Pa," Lucy said, swinging her legs. "She knows how to braid hair and cook good food, and she doesn't get mad when I ask questions." "What kind of questions?" "About the mountains and animals and why some people don't have homes," Lucy replied. "She said it's good to ask questions, even if there aren't always answers." Wise advice, Jake thought. "Did she tell you about living in the mountains?" Lucy nodded enthusiastically. "She showed me how to tell different animal tracks apart and how to find water by looking at where plants grow greenest. She knows everything about surviving outside." When Jake returned that evening, he found evidence of Hannah's industrious day everywhere. The garden plot had been turned and prepared, the chicken coop repaired, and the house somehow more organized and welcoming. Ben was in the barn, oiling leather tack under Hannah's guidance. She was showing him the proper technique, her hands demonstrating with surprising delicacy. "Leather's like people," she was saying. "Neglect it, and it gets hard and brittle. Take care of it properly, and it'll serve you well for years." Ben nodded seriously. When he noticed Jake watching, he spoke for the first time in Hannah's presence. "Miss Hannah knows about horses?" The words were soft, barely audible, but they were words nonetheless. Jake's throat tightened with emotion. "She's teaching me about different bits and when to use them," Ben continued, growing more confident, "and how to tell if a horse is favoring one leg." Hannah glanced up at Jake, understanding passing between them. This was significant progress. That evening at dinner, the atmosphere was more relaxed than it had been in years. Lucy chatted happily, Ben actually participated with short sentences, and Hannah proved an engaging storyteller with tales of mountain wildlife. "Tell about the bear," Lucy pleaded. "Well," Hannah began, "there was this old grizzly that used to visit the creek where I camped. Biggest bear you ever saw, with silver-tipped fur and scars across his muzzle." Ben leaned forward, captivated. "Were you scared?" Hannah considered seriously. "Respectful. Fear can make you do foolish things, but respect keeps you alive. That old bear and I learned to share the territory. He'd fish upstream. I'd fish downstream." "Did you ever see him up close?" Lucy asked, eyes wide. "Close enough to count his teeth," Hannah replied with a slight smile. "But that's a story for another night. Time for bed." As Jake tucked his children into bed, he marveled at the change. Lucy fell asleep quickly, still neat in Hannah's braid, contentment on her face. Ben lingered awake but looked peaceful rather than haunted. When Jake returned to the main room, Hannah was mending Lucy's dress by lamplight, her needle moving with practiced skill. "Thank you," he said, settling by the fire, "for today, for helping with the children. Ben hasn't spoken that much in months." Hannah looked up from her sewing. "He's a good boy with a heavy burden. Sometimes it just takes time and the right listener." "And you're the right listener." Hannah's hand stilled. "I understand what it's like to lose someone you love, to feel like speaking about it makes it too real." There was pain in her voice, old and deep. Jake wanted to ask about it, but her posture warned him off. Instead, he watched her work, noting the evenness of her stitches. "You're full of surprises," he observed. "Most women living wild in the mountains don't know needlework." Hannah's smile was rueful. "Most women living wild weren't raised in civilization first." Another piece of the puzzle. Why the mountains? What drove you to that life? Hannah's needle resumed its rhythm. Sometimes a person needs to disappear for a while. The mountains don't ask questions or make demands. "And now?" Hannah looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Now I'm here if you'll have me. Ready to be part of something again." There was vulnerability beneath her steady gaze, a question beyond simple employment. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the walls built around his heart. "We're better with you here," he said simply. "All of us." A soft sound from outside interrupted the moment. Wind through grass, or perhaps something more deliberate. Hannah's head turned toward the window, her body going alert with watchful tension. "What is it?" Jake asked, his senses sharpening. "Probably nothing," Hannah said, but her eyes remained fixed on the darkened window. "Just old habits. When you live alone in wilderness, you learn to pay attention to sounds that don't belong." Jake moved to the window, peering out at the moonlit yard. Everything appeared normal. Barn dark and quiet, pasture empty except for cattle. But Hannah's alertness awakened his own caution. "Tell me about the mountains," he said, returning to his chair but keeping his voice low. Hannah set aside her mending. "Beautiful. Hard, but beautiful. There's a clarity up there you can't find anywhere else. Just you and the land, and whatever strength you can muster. Lonely? Sometimes, but loneliness was better than—" She trailed off. "Better than what?" Hannah's eyes met his, and in them he saw old pain, carefully guarded. "Better than being hurt by people who were supposed to protect you." The words hung heavy with implication. Jake felt protective anger toward whatever had driven this woman to mountain wilderness. "That won't happen here," he said with quiet conviction. "Not while I draw breath." Hannah studied his face, weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "I believe you." It was a beginning, fragile but real. As they sat in comfortable silence, fire crackling between them and children sleeping peacefully, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. Outside, wind continued its song across Texas plains, and somewhere in darkness, a nightbird called with lonely persistence. But inside the Morrison ranch house, warmth and possibility were taking root in soil barren too long. Hannah Rivers had brought more than labor and skills. She had brought promise of healing, a family rebuilt from broken pieces. And as Jake watched her face in firelight, he began to understand that $3 might prove the wisest investment he had ever made. 3 days passed in peaceful routine at the Morrison Ranch. Hannah rose before dawn each morning, tending to chores with quiet efficiency that impressed Jake more each day. She had a way with the animals that bordered on magical. The temperamental milk cow stood calm for her, the chickens flocked to her call, and even Jake's stubborn horse seemed gentle under her touch. More importantly, the children continued to thrive under her care. Ben spoke more each day, sharing observations about the ranch work and even asking questions about Hannah's mountain survival techniques. Lucy had taken to following Hannah everywhere, chattering constantly about everything from wildflowers to why the sky was blue. On the 4th morning, Jake was mending harness in the barn when he heard approaching hoofbeats, a single rider coming fast across the range, unusual for their remote location. He set down his tools and stepped into the yard, automatically checking that his colt was secure at his hip. The rider was a stranger, well-dressed despite the dust of travel. He sat his horse with easy confidence, his clothes speaking of city origins rather than ranch work. As he drew closer, Jake could make out a lean face with sharp eyes and a carefully trimmed beard. Everything about the man suggested education and money, dangerous combinations in Jake's experience. "You Jake Morrison?" the stranger called out, reining in his horse a respectful distance from the house. "That's me," Jake replied, not moving from his position near the barn door. "What's your business here?" The man dismounted with fluid grace, his movements suggesting familiarity with both saddle and finer surroundings. "Name's Marcus Wheeler," he said, approaching with an extended hand. "From San Antonio originally, though I've been traveling quite a bit lately." Jake shook the offered hand briefly, noting the softness that spoke of desk work rather than manual labor. "Long way from San Antonio, Mr. Wheeler. What brings you to my land?" Wheeler's smile was practiced, the kind Jake had seen on traveling salesmen and politicians. "Business, I'm afraid. I'm tracking a certain individual, following rumors and whispers across 3 counties. Imagine my surprise when I heard in Redemption that Jake Morrison had purchased a woman at auction." A cold feeling settled in Jake's stomach. He kept his expression neutral, but his hand drifted closer to his weapon. "My affairs are my own business, Wheeler." Of course," Wheeler said smoothly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "No offense intended. I merely wish to confirm something." His eyes shifted to look past Jake, and his practiced smile widened. And it seems I have. Jake turned to see Hannah standing in the doorway of the house, her face pale but composed. Ben and Lucy were nowhere to be seen. Safely inside, Jake hoped. Hannah stepped onto the porch, her movements controlled, despite what Jake could now see was carefully contained fear. "Mr. Wheeler," she acknowledged, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "Well, well," Wheeler said softly, his tone almost conversational. "There you are, my dear. You've led me quite a chase across half of Texas." Jake looked between them, pieces clicking together with uncomfortable clarity. "You two know each other." "Oh yes," Wheeler replied, never taking his eyes off Hannah. "Miss Rivers and I are old acquaintances, or should I say, Miss Catherine Bennett." Hannah didn't flinch at the name, but Jake saw her hands curl into fists at her sides. "It's Hannah now," she said quietly. "Has been for some time." Wheeler shrugged elegantly. "Names change, my dear, but people rarely do." He turned to Jake, his expression becoming more serious. "Did she tell you why she was hiding in those mountains, Morrison? Did she explain why she changed her name? Why she's been running?" "That's her business," Jake said firmly, though curiosity burned in his chest. "Perhaps," Wheeler conceded, "but it becomes your business when you bring her into your home, around your children." His emphasis on the last word carried a clear warning. Jake's hand moved to his revolver grip. "Say what you came to say, Wheeler." Wheeler's smile turned cold. "Very well. Direct as always, I see." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "There are people looking for Miss Bennett here. People with considerable resources and influence. People willing to pay handsomely for information leading to her return." "I'm not for sale," Hannah said, her voice like steel. "Not anymore." "Everyone has a price, my dear," Wheeler replied smoothly. "Even our friend Morrison here." He turned to Jake. "How much did you pay for her?" $3, I heard. I'm authorized to offer you $500 for the same merchandise." Anger flared hot in Jake's chest. "She's not merchandise," he growled, "and she's not for sale. Not for 500, not for 5,000. Something like approval flickered in Hannah's eyes, quickly masked. Wheeler studied Jake thoughtfully. "You always were an idealist, Morrison. Your father mentioned it often, considered it your greatest weakness." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "You knew my father?" Wheeler nodded. "Samuel Morrison was a good man, if somewhat rigid in his principles. He worked for my employer in Tennessee before bringing his family west. Judge Harrison spoke of him fondly." Understanding dawned cold and clear. Judge Harrison, the man hunting Hannah. "The man seeking justice," Wheeler corrected smoothly. "Miss Bennett here is wanted for murder, Morrison. She killed the judge's son in Nashville 2 years ago." "That's a lie," Hannah said, stepping forward despite Jake's restraining gesture. "Victor Harrison tried to kill me and my sister. I defended myself." Wheeler's expression remained skeptical. "So you claim, yet witnesses tell a different story. They say you were jealous of your sister's engagement to Victor, that you threatened him repeatedly before shooting him in cold blood." "Lies," Hannah repeated, but Jake heard the tremor in her voice now. "Victor was beating Rachel. When I found them, he turned on me with a poker. I had no choice." "A convenient story," Wheeler said coldly. "One that no longer matters, since your sister isn't here to corroborate it." Pain flashed across Hannah's face, raw and devastating. "What do you mean?" Wheeler reached into his coat again, this time producing a small object that caught the morning light. Even from a distance, Jake could see it was a locket of some kind. "Poor Rachel," Wheeler said softly. "So young, so trusting. She tried to run after you, fled Nashville, you know. Made it almost to Arkansas before Judge Harrison's men found her." Hannah made a sound like a wounded animal, reaching toward the locket. "Where did you get that?" "From Rachel herself," Wheeler replied, pocketing the item again. "Right before she told us the truth about what really happened that night, about how you killed Victor in a jealous rage, then convinced her to lie to protect you." "You're lying," Hannah whispered, but doubt had crept into her voice. "Rachel would never. She knew what Victor did to her." "People say many things when they're dying," Wheeler observed coldly. Your sister wanted to make peace with God before the end. She told us everything." Jake watched Hannah's face crumble, saw the fight go out of her as Wheeler's words found their mark. Whether the man was lying or not, he had shaken her to her core. "That's enough," Jake said firmly, stepping between Wheeler and Hannah. "You've delivered your message. Now get off my land." Wheeler's expression hardened. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Morrison. I have a warrant for Miss Bennett's arrest, properly signed by Judge Harrison himself." He produced another document. "She's coming back to Nashville with me, one way or another." "Over my dead body," Jake said quietly, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. Wheeler studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If necessary," he said. "But consider this, Morrison. You have children to think about. Innocent children who don't deserve to be caught in the middle of someone else's sins." The threat was barely veiled, but unmistakable. Jake felt Hannah's hand touch his arm, felt her trying to step around him. "Don't," she said softly. "Jake, don't do this. He's right about the children." "No," Jake said firmly, not taking his eyes off Wheeler. "You're part of this family now. We don't abandon family." Wheeler watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "How touching," he said finally. "But family loyalty won't stop a federal warrant, Morrison. I'll be back with proper authorities. You have until tomorrow to reconsider." He remounted his horse with the same fluid grace, looking down at them with cold satisfaction. "Think carefully about your next move, Morrison. Judge Harrison is not a man who accepts defiance lightly. He has a long reach and a longer memory." With that, Wheeler wheeled his horse around and rode away, his figure quickly disappearing into the heat shimmer of the Texas morning. But his words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and threatening. Jake turned to find Hannah watching him with something like wonder in her gray eyes. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why defend me when you don't even know if what he said is true?" Jake considered the question, looking at this woman who had brought laughter back to his children's voices, who had made his house feel like a home again. "Because I know you," he said finally. "I've seen who you are with Ben and Lucy, how you work, how you treat everything living creature on this ranch. That's worth more than the word of any smooth-talking bounty hunter." Hannah's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. "You don't understand. Judge Harrison won't stop. He has money, influence, connections throughout Texas. And if Rachel really told them—" "Did you murder Victor Harrison in cold blood?" Jake asked directly. "No," Hannah said without hesitation. "I killed him, yes, but it was self-defense. He was going to kill Rachel, then me. I had no choice." "Then we'll prove it," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "Truth has a way of coming out, especially when there are people willing to fight for it." From inside the house came the sound of running feet, and Lucy burst onto the porch, followed closely by Ben. Both children had clearly been listening from the window. "Is the bad man going to take Miss Hannah away?" Lucy asked, her small voice thick with tears. Jake knelt to gather his daughter in his arms. "No, sweetheart. Miss Hannah isn't going anywhere." Ben stepped closer to Hannah, his young face set with determination beyond his years. "We won't let them take you," he said quietly. "You're family now." Hannah looked down at the boy who had spoken so little for so long, now offering his protection with simple dignity. When she knelt to his level, Jake saw her composure finally crack. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling both children into her embrace. "All of you. I never hoped for family again." "You've got one now," Jake said firmly, "and we protect our own." But even as he spoke the brave words, Jake's mind was racing through options, calculating odds, planning for what he knew would come. Wheeler would be back, probably with help, definitely with legal authority that would be hard to challenge in frontier courts. They had until tomorrow, maybe less. It would have to be enough. As the family gathered inside the house, Jake began to make preparations. If Judge Harrison wanted Hannah, he would have to come through Jake Morrison first, and Jake had no intention of making it easy for him. The attack came at dawn, when the Texas sky was still painted in shades of pink and gold. Jake woke to the sound of hoofbeats, many horses moving fast across the hard-pan earth toward the ranch. He rolled from his bed, grabbing his rifle and moving to the window in one fluid motion, honed by years of frontier living. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least a dozen riders spread in a wide arc around the ranch house, moving with military precision. Wheeler sat his horse at the center, but now he was flanked by men who looked like they knew how to use the weapons they carried. "Hannah," Jake called softly, not wanting to wake the children unnecessarily, but needing her aware of what was coming. She appeared in the doorway instantly, already dressed and alert. During their hasty planning the night before, they had agreed she would sleep in her clothes, ready for whatever Wheeler might bring. "How many?" she asked, moving to another window. "Dozen, maybe more," Jake replied grimly. Wheeler wasn't bluffing about having resources. Hannah's face was pale but determined. "The children? Still sleeping. We keep it that way as long as possible." Wheeler's voice carried across the morning air, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Morrison, send out Catherine Bennett, and this ends peacefully. You have 5 minutes to decide." Jake didn't bother responding. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to decide. Hannah was family now, and family didn't get handed over to men with guns and warrants. Instead, he began checking his weapons. Rifle loaded, extra ammunition within reach, his Colt .45 clean and ready. Hannah moved through the house with quiet efficiency, gathering supplies into a bag they had prepared. Food, water, medical supplies, ammunition. "The root cellar," Jake said quietly. "You remember the way out?" Hannah nodded. During the previous evening, Jake had shown her the escape tunnel his predecessor had dug, a narrow passage that led from the cellar under the house to an exit concealed behind the barn. It had been built during the Indian Wars, when such precautions meant the difference between life and death. The sound of breaking glass from the front room ended their whispered conversation. A flaming bottle had crashed through the window, spreading kerosene fire across the wooden floor. "Time's up, Morrison," Wheeler called out. "Send her out, or we burn you out." More bottles followed, crashing through windows on all sides of the house. The dry wood caught quickly, flames spreading with terrifying speed through rooms that held 3 years of memories and hope. Ben appeared in his doorway, eyes wide with terror that was all too familiar. The sight of fire had awakened every nightmare he'd carried since his mother's death. "Pa," he whispered, his voice small and scared. "It's all right, son," Jake said, scooping the boy up while Hannah grabbed Lucy from her bed. The little girl woke confused and frightened, clinging to Hannah with desperate strength. Smoke was filling the house now, making breathing difficult and visibility poor. Jake led them quickly to the kitchen, pulling up the trap door that led to the root cellar. The narrow opening yawned dark and cool below them. "Down you go," Jake said, helping Hannah lower the children into the tunnel entrance. Lucy went first, then Ben, both trusting their father and Hannah to keep them safe. Hannah paused at the tunnel mouth, looking back at Jake. "You're coming with us?" "Right behind you," Jake promised, though they both knew someone had to delay Wheeler's men, buy time for the family to escape through the tunnel. Hannah's gray eyes held his for a moment, understanding passing between them. Then she dropped into the tunnel after the children, her whispered, "I love you," barely audible above the crackling flames. Jake stayed long enough to fire several shots through the burning windows, making Wheeler's men take cover and think twice about rushing the house. The heat was becoming unbearable, smoke searing his lungs with each breath. As flames began eating through the roof beams above him, Jake finally dropped through the trap door into the blessed coolness of the cellar. The tunnel stretched ahead of him, narrow and dark, but offering the hope of escape. He crawled through the passage as quickly as possible, his rifle clutched in one hand, while debris from the burning house crashed down behind him. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever. Each foot gained an eternity of scraped knees and aching shoulders. When he finally emerged behind the barn, Hannah was waiting with the children and their horses, saddled and ready. Her efficiency in crisis impressed him once again. She had managed to prepare for flight while keeping both children calm and quiet. "The house?" she asked quietly. Jake glanced back to see flames shooting through what had been their kitchen window. "Gone," he said simply. 3 years of rebuilding after the first fire, all reduced to ash and memory. Lucy began to cry at the sight of their home burning, the same flames that had taken her mother now claiming everything familiar and safe. Hannah gathered the little girl close, murmuring comfort while Jake lifted Ben onto his horse. "Where do we go?" Ben asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his young eyes. "The Harper Ranch," Jake decided. "Tom Harper's no friend of outsiders with guns. He'll give us shelter until we figure out our next move." They rode away from the burning ranch in the gray light of dawn, smoke rising behind them like a funeral pyre for the life they had tried to build. Wheeler's men were too busy controlling the fire to notice their escape immediately, but Jake knew pursuit would come soon. The Harper Ranch lay 10 miles north through rough country that favored those who knew the land. Jake led them along deer trails and creek beds, paths invisible to city men, but clear as highways to someone who had lived here for 15 years. Hannah rode behind him, Lucy secure in her arms, both children trusting these adults to lead them to safety. But Jake could see the strain in Hannah's face, the guilt that ate at her as she watched their home burn because of her past. They had covered perhaps 5 miles when Jake heard the sound he'd been dreading, hoofbeats behind them, growing closer. Wheeler had discovered their escape and was following with at least half his men. "How far to Harper's?" Hannah called out. 5 miles, maybe 6, Jake replied, urging his horse to greater speed. "But they're gaining." The pursuit stretched across the broken landscape. Horses and riders pushed to their limits in the growing heat of the day. Jake's mount was strong, but carried double with Ben, while Hannah's horse bore her and Lucy. Wheeler's men rode lighter, their animals fresher. At a stream crossing, Jake made a decision that might save them or doom them all. "This way," he called, turning upstream instead of continuing toward Harper's ranch. "That's not the way to safety," Hannah protested. "No," Jake agreed grimly. "But it's the way to Eagle Canyon. If we can reach the Narrows before they catch us, we can hold them off." Eagle Canyon was a slot in the red rock country, barely wide enough for a single rider. At its narrowest point, one man with a rifle could hold off an army, but reaching it meant another 5 miles of hard riding with pursuit closing in. The gamble almost failed. Wheeler's men were within rifle range when Jake's small party reached the canyon mouth. Bullets whined off the rock walls around them as they plunged into the narrow passage. Inside the canyon, the world changed. Walls of red stone soared overhead, blocking out most of the sky and turning the passage into a twilight maze of echoing hoofbeats and whispered fears. But they were safe for the moment. The canyon was too narrow for Wheeler's men to surround them. Jake found a defensible position where the passage widened slightly, a spot where fallen rocks provided cover and clear sight lines back toward the entrance. He helped the children down from the horses, then checked his remaining ammunition. Not much for a prolonged fight. "There's a way out at the far end," he told Hannah quietly, "about 2 miles through the canyon. If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Hannah said firmly. "We're in this together, remember?" Wheeler's voice echoed off the canyon walls, distorted but audible. "Morrison, you're trapped in there. Send out the woman and you and your children can walk away from this." Jake didn't respond. He had nothing to say to men who would burn a home with children inside. The first assault came an hour later, when Wheeler had positioned his men at both ends of the canyon. The sound of gunfire ricocheted between the stone walls like thunder, deafening in the confined space. Jake and Hannah returned fire carefully, making each shot count. The children huddled behind the largest boulder, Lucy crying quietly while Ben tried to comfort her with a maturity no 9-year-old should need. "Pa!" Ben called out during a lull in the shooting. "There's another way." Jake looked back to see his son pointing at a crack in the canyon wall, barely visible in the shadows. It looked like it might be wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Where does it go?" Jake asked. "Don't know," Ben replied. "But Miss Hannah says sometimes the best way out is the way nobody expects." Hannah looked at the crack, then at Jake. "It's worth trying. Better than staying pinned down here." Another volley of gunfire decided the matter. Jake gathered what supplies they could carry, then helped the children toward the hidden passage. Hannah went first, her smaller frame able to navigate the tight space more easily. The passage was a nightmare of sharp rocks and total darkness, barely wide enough for Jake's shoulders. They moved by feel, following the sound of Hannah's voice ahead of them, trusting that the crack would lead somewhere other than a dead end. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they emerged blinking into sunlight on a ledge halfway up the canyon wall. Below them, Wheeler's men continued firing into the empty rocks where they had been hiding. "Can we get down from here?" Jake asked, studying the steep slope below them. Hannah nodded toward a game trail that switched back down the canyon face. "It'll be dangerous, but possible. Animals use it, so we can too." The descent was terrifying, especially with the children, but they made it without serious injury. By the time Wheeler's men realized their quarry had vanished, Jake's family was already miles away, following hidden paths toward the Harper ranch. They reached Tom Harper's spread as the sun was setting, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dust and smoke. Harper himself met them at the door, his weathered face grim with understanding as he took in their condition. "Trouble?" he asked simply. "The worst kind," Jake replied. "Men with guns and warrants, chasing Hannah for something she didn't do." Harper nodded, stepping back to let them enter. "My Sarah will see to the young ones. You two look like you need rest and food in that order." As they settled around Harper's rough table, sharing the first hot meal they'd had since the morning's attack, Jake felt the weight of what they faced. Wheeler would regroup, probably gather more men. Judge Harrison's influence would spread like a web across Texas, making it impossible to find lasting safety. But looking at his children, already beginning to recover their spirits under Sarah Harper's motherly care, and at Hannah, who had risked everything to protect them, Jake felt something stronger than fear. He felt the fierce determination of a man defending his family. Wheeler had burned their home, scattered their lives, threatened everything Jake held dear. But he had also made a crucial mistake. He had underestimated what Jake Morrison would do to protect the people he loved. The war was just beginning, and Jake intended to win it. 3 days of relative safety at the Harper Ranch gave Jake time to think, but no easy answers emerged from his deliberation. Wheeler had burned their home and would certainly return with reinforcements. Judge Harrison's reach extended far beyond Tennessee, and every day they remained in one place increased the danger to the Harper family who had sheltered them. On the 4th morning, salvation arrived in an unexpected form. A lone rider approached the Harper Ranch, but this time it wasn't Wheeler or his hired guns. The man who dismounted at the gate wore a federal marshal's badge and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to bringing law to lawless places. Marshal Robert Davis, he introduced himself to Tom Harper, who had emerged to meet this latest visitor. "I'm looking for Jake Morrison and a woman named Catherine Bennett." Jake stepped onto the porch, his hand instinctively near his weapon. "I'm Morrison. What's your business with us, Marshal?" Davis studied Jake with shrewd eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily fooled. "Received a telegram from Sheriff Wilson in Redemption. Says there's been some irregularities in how certain warrants are being served in his territory. Thought I might investigate personally." Hope flickered in Jake's chest, but caution kept his voice level. "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind where buildings get burned and families get terrorized," Davis replied grimly. "That's federal business when it crosses county lines, which this situation clearly has." Hannah appeared in the doorway, the children flanking her like guards. Marshal Davis touched his hat respectfully. "Miss Bennett, I presume? I'd like to hear your version of events if you are willing." "Why should she trust you?" Jake interjected. Wheeler claimed to have legal authority too. Davis's expression darkened. "Marcus Wheeler is many things, but a legitimate federal officer isn't one of them. He's a bounty hunter with connections to powerful men who prefer working outside proper legal channels." From his saddlebags, Davis withdrew a thick folder of documents. "I've been investigating Judge Harrison for 6 months, following reports of corruption and abuse of judicial authority. Your case, Miss Bennett, has become a key piece of that investigation." Hannah's composure cracked slightly. "You know about Rachel? Your sister?" "Yes, ma'am. That's actually why I'm here." Davis's voice gentled with genuine sympathy. "Miss Bennett, I have information that might interest you about what really happened to Rachel after you fled Nashville." Jake felt Hannah's hand find his arm, seeking support as she braced for whatever revelation was coming. "Rachel Bennett didn't die in Colorado," Davis said carefully. "She was taken into protective custody by a federal agent working undercover in Judge Harrison's organization. She's been living under an assumed name in Denver for the past 2 years." The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. She swayed, and Jake's arm went around her instantly, holding her steady as she processed this impossible news. "That's not possible," Hannah whispered. "I buried her myself. I saw her die from the fever." Davis shook his head gently. "You buried someone, Miss Bennett, but it wasn't your sister. Rachel recovered from her injuries and was spirited away by our people before Wheeler could get to her. We needed her testimony to build our case against Judge Harrison." "Then the locket—" Hannah's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "A fake, most likely. Wheeler's been using that trinket to manipulate you for months, probably knowing you'd never question its authenticity if you believed Rachel was dead." Jake felt the tremor that ran through Hannah as years of grief and guilt began to crumble under this revelation. "Where is she now? Can I see her?" "She's safe in Denver, waiting for the trial to begin. Judge Harrison and several of his associates are going to face federal charges for corruption, murder, and conspiracy. Your testimony, combined with Rachel's and evidence we've gathered, should be enough to put them away permanently." "What about Wheeler?" Jake asked grimly. Davis's expression hardened. "Wheeler's wanted on multiple federal charges now. Arson, terroristic threats, attempted kidnapping. The list keeps growing. When we catch him, and we will, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." As if summoned by mention of his name, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But these weren't the measured hoofbeats of a single rider. This was the thunder of many horses moving fast. Wheeler appeared at the head of at least 20 armed men, his earlier restraint abandoned in favor of overwhelming force. His face was twisted with fury as he saw Marshal Davis's presence. "Federal marshal or not," Wheeler called out, his voice carrying across the yard, "I have a legal warrant for that woman's arrest. She's coming with me." Davis stepped forward, his hand resting on his weapon. "Your warrant isn't worth the paper it's printed on, Wheeler. Judge Harrison's been suspended from the bench pending federal investigation. Any documents he's issued in the past 6 months are invalid." "I don't care about federal politics," Wheeler snarled. "I came here to collect a bounty, and I'm not leaving empty-handed." The standoff stretched taut as wire, 20 desperate men facing 5 defenders. Jake counted ammunition in his head, calculated angles and cover, prepared for what looked like an inevitable fight. Then Ben's voice cut through the tension, high and clear. "Miss Hannah, look!" Everyone's attention turned to where the boy was pointing. On the ridge behind Wheeler's men, more riders were appearing, but these wore the uniforms of federal officers and carried themselves with military precision. "Deputy marshals," Davis announced with satisfaction. "I didn't come alone, Wheeler. You're surrounded." Wheeler's face went through a series of expressions: rage, calculation, and finally desperate cunning. "Maybe so, Marshal, but I've still got enough men to make this costly for everyone. How many lives is that woman worth to you?" Before Davis could answer, Hannah stepped forward. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. "I'll come with you, Wheeler, but you let these people go unharmed." "Hannah, no," Jake said urgently, reaching for her. She turned to him, her gray eyes soft with love and determination. "I won't have more innocent blood on my hands. Not the children, not the Harpers, not you." "That's very noble," Wheeler said mockingly. "But I'm afraid the situation's changed. Judge Harrison wants Morrison dead as well. Can't have witnesses to what happened here." The declaration hung in the air like a death sentence. Wheeler had revealed his true intentions, and Jake saw murder in the man's eyes. "Then you've made your last mistake," Marshal Davis said coldly. At his signal, the federal officers on the ridge began closing in, their rifles trained on Wheeler's men. What followed wasn't a battle, but a rout. Wheeler's hired guns, faced with professional lawmen in superior numbers, lost their nerve quickly. Some threw down their weapons immediately, others tried to flee, but were captured before they could escape the net Davis had thrown around them. Wheeler himself fought to the end, drawing his weapon in a desperate attempt to kill Hannah before he could be stopped. But Jake was faster, his Colt clearing leather and firing in one smooth motion, born of years of frontier living. Wheeler spun backward off his horse, his fancy clothes now stained with Texas dust and his own blood. He tried to speak, perhaps to deliver some final threat or curse, but only blood came from his mouth. Marshal Davis knelt beside the dying man, professional to the end. "Marcus Wheeler, you're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy, though I doubt you'll live to stand trial." Wheeler's eyes found Hannah one last time, filled with hatred that death couldn't diminish. Then the light faded, and Judge Harrison's most dangerous weapon was finally silenced. In the aftermath, as federal officers processed the surviving members of Wheeler's gang, Marshal Davis approached Jake and Hannah. "It's over," he said simply. "Judge Harrison's network is broken, Wheeler's dead, and you're free to rebuild your lives." Hannah leaned against Jake, exhaustion and relief warring in her expression. "When can I see Rachel?" "Soon as you're ready to travel to Denver," Davis promised. "She's been asking about you every day for 2 years, hoping we'd find you alive." Jake looked at the children, who had watched the entire confrontation with wide eyes but remarkable composure. Ben stood protective beside Lucy, both of them staying close to Hannah despite the violence they'd witnessed. "We'll need to rebuild," Jake said, thinking of the ranch house reduced to ash in memory. "Start over from nothing." Hannah's hand found his, fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had developed between them. "Not from nothing," she corrected softly. "We have each other. We have the children. We have the truth, finally." Marshal Davis cleared his throat diplomatically. "The federal government pays substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of wanted criminals. Between Wheeler's bounty and evidence about Judge Harrison's corruption, you folks are looking at enough money to rebuild twice over." As the sun began to set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison stood surrounded by his chosen family and watched the last of Wheeler's men being led away in chains. His home was gone, but his family was safe and whole. More than that, they were free from the shadow of false accusations, free from the fear of pursuit, free to build whatever future they chose together. The war was over, and they had won more than Jake had ever dared hope. The train to Denver carried more than passengers. It carried the weight of 2 years' worth of grief, hope, and desperate longing. Hannah sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the Texas landscape give way to Colorado mountains. Beside her, Jake kept silent vigil, understanding that words couldn't ease the mixture of anticipation and fear that radiated from her like heat from a forge. Ben and Lucy pressed their faces to the opposite window, marveling at their first train ride and the changing scenery outside. The federal reward money had bought them first-class tickets, new clothes, and the promise of a future free from want. But none of that mattered as much as the reunion waiting at the end of their journey. "What if she doesn't recognize me?" Hannah asked suddenly, her voice barely audible above the train's rhythmic clacking. "What if 2 years have changed her so much that we're strangers now?" Jake covered her hand with his own, feeling the tremor of anxiety beneath her composed exterior. "She's your sister," he said simply. "Blood doesn't forget blood." Marshal Davis had traveled with them, both as escort and as witness to the reunion that would finally close the books on Judge Harrison's reign of corruption. He sat across the aisle, reviewing documents that would soon put powerful men behind bars for the rest of their lives. "The safe house is just outside Denver," Davis had explained during their planning. "Rachel's been working as a school teacher under the name Sarah Collins. She's changed some from her injuries, but she's alive and healthy and asking about you every day." Hannah nodded, trying to prepare herself for whatever changes 2 years of hiding and healing might have wrought in her younger sister. The last time she'd seen Rachel, the girl had been broken in body and spirit, barely clinging to life after Victor Harrison's brutal attack. The train pulled into Denver's Union Station as afternoon shadows were lengthening into evening. The platform bustled with travelers, vendors, and porters, but Hannah saw none of them. Her attention was fixed on the small group waiting near the station house. A woman in a simple blue dress, flanked by 2 federal agents. Even at a distance, even after 2 years, Hannah would have recognized her sister anywhere. Rachel had grown thinner, her face marked by experiences that had aged her beyond her years, but her posture was straight and her eyes alert. She was no longer the fragile girl Hannah remembered, but a woman who had survived hell and emerged stronger. Their eyes met across the crowded platform, and the years collapsed into nothing. Rachel broke from her escorts and ran, her careful composure dissolving into tears and desperate joy. Hannah met her halfway, and they collided in an embrace that spoke of grief survived, love endured, and hope finally rewarded. "I thought you were dead," Hannah whispered against her sister's hair. "They told me you died in Colorado. I buried someone, thinking it was you." "Mary Whitfield," Rachel said softly. "A woman about my age who died of fever around the same time I was supposed to. The agents staged my death to protect me from Judge Harrison's reach." They held each other at arm's length, cataloging the changes time and trauma had written on familiar faces. Rachel bore scars, a thin line across her left cheek, a slight stiffness in her right arm where Victor's beating had broken bones. But her gray eyes, so like Hannah's own, were clear and determined. "You're different," Rachel observed, studying her sister with the same intensity. "Stronger somehow. The mountains changed you." "Everything changed me," Hannah replied. "Losing you, thinking I'd failed to protect you, it nearly broke me. But then I found Jake and the children, and they gave me a reason to hope again." Jake approached with Ben and Lucy, giving the sisters space but remaining close enough to offer support. Rachel's gaze moved to them with curiosity and gratitude. "So this is the family that saved my sister," she said, her voice warm despite her tears. "Marshall Davis has told me so much about all of you." Ben stepped forward with the quiet dignity that had become his trademark. "We're glad you're alive," he said simply. "Miss Hannah cried for you sometimes, when she thought we couldn't see." Rachel knelt to his level, her expression softening. "Thank you for taking care of her. She's lucky to have such a brave protector." Lucy, emboldened by her brother's example, moved closer. "Are you going to come live with us? We're building a new house where the old one burned down." "We'll see," Rachel said gently. "There are some things I have to do first, some bad men who need to face justice for what they did. But after that," she looked up at Hannah with a question in her eyes. "After that, your family," Hannah said firmly. "Whatever you want, wherever you want to go, we'll make it work." The reunion continued at the Federal Safe House, a modest building on Denver's outskirts that had sheltered Rachel during her long wait for justice. Over dinner prepared by the agent's housekeeper, the sisters shared their stories. Rachel's account of her rescue and hidden recovery, Hannah's tale of mountain survival, and the family she'd found with Jake. "Victor Harrison died badly," Rachel said when the conversation turned to their tormentor. "Marshall Davis showed me the report. He lived just long enough to know that his father couldn't save him, couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions." "Good," Hannah said with quiet vehemence. "After what he did to you, to both of us, he deserved worse." Rachel's hand found her sister's across the table. "I don't carry that anger anymore, Hannah. The agents helped me understand that rage only poisoned the person carrying it. Victor was a sick, violent man, but he's dead now. We survived, and we're together again. That's what matters." Jake watched this exchange with deep respect for both women. They had each found their own way to process trauma and loss. Each had survived in their own fashion, and now they were choosing healing over hatred. "What about Judge Harrison?" Jake asked Marshall Davis. "Federal prison for life," Davis replied with satisfaction. "Conspiracy, murder, corruption, abuse of judicial authority. The list of charges runs 3 pages long. His political connections can't save him from federal justice." 3 days later, they attended the trial that would officially close this chapter of their lives. Rachel testified with quiet strength about Victor's attack and the judge's subsequent attempts to silence her. Hannah provided corroborating evidence about their flight and the years of pursuit that followed. Judge Harrison, once powerful and intimidating, looked like what he was, an old man facing the consequences of a lifetime of corruption and abuse. His attempts to maintain his dignity in the face of overwhelming evidence were pathetic rather than threatening. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole," the federal judge announced. "May God have mercy on your soul, because this court will not." As they left the courthouse, Hannah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd carried so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and the man who had destroyed so many lives would harm no one else. "It's really over," she said to Jake as they walked back to their hotel. "This part is," Jake agreed. "Now we get to decide what comes next." What came next was a wedding, not the elaborate affair that society might have expected, but a simple ceremony in the Denver courthouse with Rachel as maid of honor, and Ben and Lucy as witnesses. Marshal Davis performed the honors, using his authority as a federal officer to make their union legal and binding. Hannah wore a new dress of pale blue silk, purchased with reward money but chosen for its simplicity rather than its cost. Jake wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion, but still bearing the marks of a man who worked with his hands. "Do you, Jacob Morrison, take Catherine Bennett to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Davis asked formally. "I do," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the emotion Jake could see in his eyes. "And it's Hannah now. Hannah Morrison." "Do you, Hannah Morrison, take Jacob Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Hannah said, her voice clear and strong. "For better or worse, in sickness and health, for as long as we both shall live." The kiss that sealed their union was gentle but firm, a promise made before witnesses who had seen them tested by fire and found them worthy of each other. That evening, as they celebrated with a quiet dinner at Denver's finest restaurant, Rachel announced her decision about the future. "I want to come to Texas with you," she said, "not because I'm afraid to be alone, but because families should be together. I can teach a school in Redemption as well as Denver." "Are you sure?" Hannah asked. "You've built a life here, made friends, found safety." Rachel smiled, the expression transforming her scarred face with its warmth. "Safety isn't a place, Hannah. It's people who love you enough to fight for you. You found that with Jake and the children. Now I want to be part of it too." 6 months later, the new Morrison house rose from the ashes of the old, larger and sturdier than its predecessor. The reward money had bought the finest materials, skilled craftsmen, and modern conveniences that made frontier living considerably easier. But the real improvements weren't in the construction. They were in the lives being lived within those walls. Ben had begun speaking freely, his silence finally broken by the security of knowing his family was safe and whole. Lucy bloomed under the attention of two mothers, Hannah and Rachel, sharing the joy of raising her. Jake, meanwhile, discovered that having Rachel as part of their family added dimension to their happiness. She brought laughter and music back to their home, her talent with the piano filling evening hours with melodies that spoke of hope and healing. On their first anniversary, Jake found Hannah standing where the old house had once been, looking at the small cemetery where Sarah and Tommy lay buried. New flowers decorated both graves, Rachel's contribution to honoring the family members she had never met. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, slipping his arms around his wife from behind. Hannah leaned back against his chest, solid and warm and permanent. "Only that it took so long for us to find each other," she said, "and that Sarah and Tommy couldn't be here to see how the story ended." "They know," Jake said with quiet conviction. "Somehow, wherever they are, they know we're happy." In the distance, they could hear Ben teaching his Aunt Rachel to handle a rifle, her laughter mixing with his patient instructions. Lucy was in the garden, picking vegetables for dinner and chattering to the chickens in the way that had become her trademark. It was a good life, built from ashes and watered with tears, but growing stronger each day. The Morrison Ranch had become more than a place. It had become a symbol of resilience, of love that conquered loss, of family that chose each other rather than simply accepting the bonds of blood. And it had all begun with $3 silver and a man brave enough to see worth where others saw only burden. "Best bargain I ever made," Jake murmured against Hannah's hair, echoing words he'd spoken long ago, but which had only grown more true with time. "Best gamble I ever took," Hannah replied, turning in his arms to face him, "trusting a stranger with my life and my heart." As the Texas sun set over their rebuilt ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Morrison family prepared for another evening of simple contentments. There would be dinner around a table filled with voices and laughter, stories shared and plans made, the comfortable rhythms of people who had found their place in the world. $3 had purchased a woman's freedom, but the true price of their happiness had been paid in courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to believe in second chances. It was a price they would gladly pay again, knowing the treasure it had brought them was beyond all measure. In the end, redemption had come not through revenge or retribution, but through love, forgiveness, and the simple recognition that some bonds transcend law, money, and the machinations of powerful men. The Morrison family was home at last, 5 years later, the Morrison Ranch had become legendary throughout Texas, not for its size or wealth, but for the story of the family who built it from ashes and love. Travelers passing through Redemption would often hear the tale in Santos General Store or around the tables of the local saloon. How Jake Morrison had bought a wild mountain woman for $3 silver and discovered she was worth more than all the gold in California. Ben Morrison, now 14, had grown tall and strong, his silence long forgotten as he worked beside his father and stepped confidently into young manhood. Lucy, 11 and spirited, could ride like the wind and shoot straighter than most grown men, taught by both her parents to be strong and independent. Hannah Morrison had become the kind of woman frontier legends were made of, respected by men, beloved by children, feared by anyone foolish enough to threaten her family. She wore her scars with pride and her happiness like armor against whatever hardships the world might bring. And Jake? Jake had learned that sometimes the best investments aren't made with careful planning or abundant resources. Sometimes they're made with $3, a desperate moment, and the courage to see worth where others see only burden. Rachel had married the new schoolmaster the previous spring, but she remained close to her sister's family, their bond unbreakable after all they had survived together. The Morrison Ranch had room for everyone who needed a place to belong. As for the graves that had started this story, Sarah and Tommy rested peacefully in their cemetery, joined now by fresh flowers every Sunday, and the knowledge that their family had found its way back to joy. In the end, Hannah Rivers had been right about one thing. Sometimes the best bargains aren't about the price you pay, but about the courage you show in the paying. $3 for a lifetime of love, $3 for a family made whole, $3 for proof that redemption comes in many forms, but always begins with someone willing to take a chance on the impossible. The bargain of several lifetimes, paid in full with interest that would compound forever. If you enjoyed this tale of love, courage, and second chances in the Wild West, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more legendary frontier tales. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have paid for Hannah's freedom? Hit that notification bell to never miss our stories of the American frontier, where ordinary people did extraordinary things and love conquered even the harshest circumstances.